All right, let's see. Testing this thing, make sure it works. Looks like it is. Microphone play there says it's got sound. So watching the stream, we'll get it. Although nobody here will actually care, right? Because they're here. So whether people aren't here can or can't hear doesn't really matter. Oh, look at that. And it's 16 minutes to 4. You guys are here right on time. I guess that's the beauty of it, right? Is if the clock is always exactly the same time, you're always on time. Or you're one of those pessimists, think you're always late. Pessimist, optimist calls a realist. And you know, the best part is almost 8 o'clock and it's light out yet. It's like magic. Honestly, my favorite time of year is like it'll wake up and it's light, go to bed and it's light. Well, I've been in Sweden, Stockholm in July, and it is like sun comes up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, down like at 11 o'clock at night. It never really totally gets very dark. Go further north, of course, get up into Lapland, sunny all the time. Depending on the time of year. I've also been in Stockholm in November, and it's exactly the opposite. And I was like, now I know why the Swedes like to drink. Because what else do you do when the sun comes up at 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning and goes down by 3? You never been to Stockholm. It's a great place to go. It really is. I recommend summer versus winter, but it's always going to be a very interesting country, very culture. And it's one of those places that for, a kid who grew up in North America and learned exactly, speak exactly one language fluently, it's one of those safe places to go. My first visit to Asia was Japan. I was not in Tokyo. I was outside. It is an industrial city about, I don't know, about an hour away from Tokyo by train. A very different experience in Tokyo, where you suddenly realize what it must be like to be illiterate. You literally can't read things, and I didn't know the language well enough to look words up in a dictionary. Now we have phones. You just point it at the sign and it translates it for you, and it's like, wow. Talk about the ultimate in laziness. It's still a quarter of 15 minutes of 4, so I really actually have no idea what time it is. Got 5 more minutes. Anybody have any questions? Anybody awake? For some value of awake, right? Ooh, some people bring their own transportation too. Sorry? What's the joke on the shirt? In computer science, there are 2 hard things in computer science: cache invalidation, naming, asynchronous callbacks, and off by 1 error. So there's actually multiple jokes there, right? It might be trying a little too hard, but I still thought this was a good shirt because, of course, we get asynchronous callbacks, which are really useful when we start talking about the ordering of events, because it's asynchrony that kind of plays with your head, because it's basically a manifestation of non-determinism. What is hash invalidation? What? Where is it? It's 0, right? That's kind of part of the joke. Off by 1 errors. There's only 2 things. You start with 0 because, okay, you don't see how cache invalidation is on the shirt? 0 cache invalidation. It is on the shirt. We agree, right? The problem you don't understand why? Oh, the joke. I mean, cache invalidation is in fact a hard thing. And we are going to pay an extreme penalty in distributed systems because our workaround for what is the problem I keep talking about, the cost of moving data to where it is to where we need it, is, hey, why don't we keep extra copies of it? Which is fine as long as it doesn't change. If you can assume immutability of your data, the world is so much simpler, right? In other words, I'm never going to change something, never going to change my mind. I don't recommend that with underwear though. World isn't actually that simple. But if we assume that the world is simple, you can cache things with no penalty. So you move things to the edge and put them pretty close to where you need them. This is in fact a huge issue in IoT, in edge devices, in metaverse. Actually, I have this friend. See if I can get into him to give a guest lecture. Uh, he works for the Linux Foundation doing running their games standards group. And one of the big things he's involved in is metaverse. And one of the challenges with metaverse is that it has really interesting and complex requirements around scaling and the ability to deliver information very quickly. Because you don't want to sit there and wait for a loading screen on your virtual reality headset while you're playing a multi-person shooter around the UBC campus. What you really want is you want that to happen quickly, but that means now we have to do all sorts of interesting and complicated things to make it all work right. And he's been doing this in the gaming business for a long time. It turns out that many of the problems that the gaming community has been trying to solve and has solved varying degrees occur again in the metaverse. It's just the metaverse is all this stuff on steroids. So, good morning. How are you? I did post the slides. I posted them this morning. If it didn't work, then I'll have to go back and post them again. But maybe I forgot to push save. I don't think so. I thought I pushed publish on the page. Like I said, I made the change this morning, so I don't know why it's not there. See, maybe eventually it will get there. Eventually it will be consistent. I won't fix it right now though, because I posted the slides and then I said, "Oh, look, there's a bug," and so I fixed it. That's why I remember. What else do you do at 6 in the morning? 7:50, 8 o'clock. We can start. Yes, good. So this is being streamed live. Actually, I didn't check to see what the camera is showing today, but like last time, I was very careful to try and get it centered on the whole room, so people who are not here can actually see everybody. I noticed the crowd is getting smaller. So let's get started. As soon as I get the mouse in the right frame. And there we go. So let's do the logistics stuff, get that out of the way. Lots of deadlines. The federal penalty drop deadline is next Monday, presumably at 11:59:59. You can procrastinate till the last possible moment if you decide that you'd rather take something different. I don't know, like quantum mechanics. Project 1 deadline was extended to January 23rd. That was to accommodate people. I do it that way. You can still continue to submit after the 23rd. On January 24th at 12:01 a.m., different grade scope project will open up. That will be the one that I'll use to distinguish between whether you were late or on time. Want to submit to Project 1 deadline or any of the projects after their deadline in the late, you will receive the grade that is highest relative I don't care. This is just trying to keep the stress level at some sort of a reasonable volume. I think most people are taking other courses, but so I don't want to be the person who this is the only class you're taking, and therefore I can have you dedicate 60 hours of your time, which really means 100. We'll wait until you get your first job. That's when that will actually happen. Tuesday also, January 23rd. Project 2 is a lot harder than Project 1, but it does require at least a little bit of work. It's the first two projects, and part of why I'm trying to get them out of the way early is because they beguile you into thinking the rest of the projects are going to be anything like them, and they're not. Project 3 is a substantive project. Project 4 is a really hard project, and Project 5 is a really hard project. And that's why those projects will all open up on Tuesday morning, have access to the starter code and the graders and whatnot, and you can start them whenever you want. So you get to find your own pace. We recommend that you try to do things earlier rather than later, but we all know that norm is deadline schedule and wait until the last possible moment. We'll warn you that you will not be implementing a valid Paxos implementation. Wait until 24 hours before the last deadline started, let alone the first deadline. If you're taking one of the alternate path options, or both of them, if you're really, really crazy, because this really is the only class you're taking, your proposals are due on the 30th of January. I will turn them around fairly quickly. Your assumption should be that you're going to start working on the project as outlined. Unless your project is a total dud, mostly what you're going to get is feedback. Change this, do that. Here are potential I want to think about the project. My office hours, which now that I actually have them all straightened out, I think, in my own head and on various pieces of paper and electronic media, today at 1 p.m., 2 p.m. I will do those on Zoom. They will be recorded. If you appear on Zoom, you may be recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, you can just simply post post a question on Piazza, and I will answer it during the office hours. If you want a less formal setting, I will do informal office hours on Discord, which will not be broadcast. It will not be recorded, and you can pop in anytime. That's this afternoon. Apparently it's at 2, 3. I don't know. Apparently it's now at 2. Yeah, I thought it was supposed to be later than that. Wait, I can't get any of these things right now, can I? I don't know. Why is it such a challenge to make this all consistent? On the other hand, I can actually point out the fact that let's see that I am at 100 to 1700 Thursday. So from there we go back. Now it's all fixed. Life is good. All right. So now it's officially back to 1600 to 1700. Why? I can't seem to get these times straight. Struggle. A couple of things that are recommended readings. You're not required to read, but you will find that they are useful if you want to know more about the topic of the lecture, or if you don't quite understand things. Sometimes having different presentations of the same material in different formats can be beneficial because different perspective will help you understand things a little better versus me standing here rambling on and on as I do. The last two are actually books. That's why there are references to the section of the books. They're both links to PDFs of the books. Why a book? God forbid that we support authors. I published, first book I published was before probably born. And I still get royalties, like $30 every quarter, but June of 1990, that book was published. So last time I talked about alternative path 1. This time I'm going to talk about alternative path 2. This is the open source software mode. The last one was challenge mode. So the objectives here are that you can find an open source project that is related to distributed systems. I don't care if that virtual reality cat open source project that you've always wanted to work on is really cool. That's not going to fly as a distributed system project. Well, unless you can find some sort of an angle. As long as you have at least some sort of tenuous link to distributed systems, you need to actually find a mentor within that community. That can be an intimidating step, but in fact, what you will normally find is that the people who work in these communities are perfectly happy to work with someone who's excited to work on their project, not necessarily with a huge skill set, because you represent an opportunity to potentially recruit somebody who can be a more significant contributor over time. Yeah, it's a little bit of a challenge. I don't think it shouldn't be a big challenge. Probably the biggest challenge there is overcoming your own social anxiety. Really hard to do that, to reach out and say, hey, with your student studying distributed systems, and I really want to work on an open source project. So you need to have someone in that community mentoring. They're not going to let you contribute anyway without somebody who's mentoring. So that's not like it's duty. You have to define specific tasks you'll undertake. I understand if you don't know exactly what those tasks are, but part of the project here is look at what needs to be done on this project. There's going to be a backlog. There's going to be bugs in Git. They're going to have issues, and you're going to go through those and pick off things that you do. It doesn't have to be code. It could be documentation. Turns out explaining things to people is every bit as educational as doing them, sometimes more. Sometimes it's harder to explain how something works or how to use something than it is to implement it. So there's value in all of those things. You need to write a proposal. That's what's due on the 30th of January. And then when you're done, you'll have to write an evaluation report. What I did on my OSS mode project. This is where you tell me, what did you get out of it? What was the benefit for you? What did you contribute to the project? I will be talking to you. I'll be looking at your bars. I'll be looking at what you did, what you wrote, and say, okay, yeah, learned something, did something useful. How do I evaluate this? How do we evaluate this? Point effort. So what is the value of your contributions? You should be telling me what you think the value of your contributions are in your project. It's an important skill in the real world. Learn to be able to promote yourself. Don't expect that people are going to just automatically see and know that what you did had value. I know. We tell everybody it's a meritocracy, and I'll be blunt, bullshit. The people I know who have done the very best in the world are almost all very good at self-promotion. What you ideally want to be is both a good self-promoter and worthy of that self-promotion. That's a really good mix. I know lots of people who are really good at self-promoting, but are in fact have the technical skills of a skateboard. Look at the random thing on the floor. What's the quality of the project proposal? How much thought did you actually put into this? Oh crap, it's due in 4 hours and I want to do this because it's really important, well, I don't know. It's going to show. Or, wow, this is a really interesting way of learning how ChatGPT can actually churn out crap for the instructor to read. I might actually take this put it in as a prompt. ChatGPT, what it generates. I don't know. I mean, people are all up in arms about ChatGPT. I'm like, this isn't anything really new. One more tool. It's like people get upset when you grammar correctors too, right? Or spell check. You know, they don't even teach kids in school anymore to write in cursive writing. No more long hours of making your handwriting beautiful. Also, you can go to med school and learn how to make it not legible. I suspect nobody here is going to med school, but the feedback from your mentor. I mean, I don't expect I'm going to have a long, deep conversation with your mentor. I'm going to basically say, so, give me some feedback. And I'm probably going to get an email back and they're going to say, yeah, great to work with, did some interesting work, had a few problems here, whatever. And then at least I will be looking at your scars. I'll be documentation. I'll be looking at what you actually did. Does this justify giving you extra credit in the objectives I have for this activity are you have to go find an open source project in distributed systems, which means you have to learn more about this field. And that by itself is a really nice objective because you're going to be sitting there going, and I've already had people go, well, what kinds of projects? I don't know. The moment I start typing distributed open source software distributed systems, I get so many hits that I could spend a lot of time. And well, of course, the first 3 pages of Google are now all ads, but even those sometimes lead to legitimate open source projects. I've got another slide that will point to a few places where you can go looking if you really are desperate, hard up, or don't know how to use Google. Has anyone? I mean, I kind of joke because one of the things that I have constantly been amazed at working in the Georgia Tech program is how many questions people post on Piazza that I answer by typing it into Google. And if you've never heard of it, there's a really cool website called lmgtfy.com. Let me Google that for you.com. I love it. And then I always take the Bing link and send it to them. Just because why make it too easy? You have to identify that mentor. Right? Evaluation, cost benefit. I went the wrong direction. And I repeat myself often enough that number. All right, so what are the benefits? You get to work on an existing project. You get to choose the project. I don't have to choose it for you. I'm not going to assign this for you. You're going to assign it. You're going to choose it. And hopefully it will be something that you find at least vaguely interesting because you don't even have to do this. You get to contribute to something real. There's a genuine good feeling about doing that, about feeling like you're part of a team that is in fact doing something, even if it's a tiny little thing like making those VR cat games faster. But you get to choose that reward. I'm not choosing. And I'm giving you that carrot of up to 40% extra credit. A lot. And to get 40%, you're gonna have to actually produce something significant. The other thing that I really liked about this particular approach is that if you actually do contribute to an open source project, this is something you can actually tell future prospective employers or grad schools, and they're going to actually be able to go look at it. No one wants to see your student code. I can tell you this, I've had this argument over and over again with people who want to make their student code from some canned project public. And it's like, no one wants to see it. No one will look at it. But if you say, hey, I worked on Zookeeper in distributed systems, people are going to go, really? What did you do? Because that's now an opener. That's now wow, you actually did something real. You didn't just do some bullshit project in university. I mean, have any of you done what you would consider a BS project at university? You've done it for this class. My gosh, project 1? It's like a total gimme. Here's the code. Type it in. Submit it. Done. The struggle for the people and the reason it's actually there is because it made you load the tools and get the environment set up and not procrastinate that till the last possible moment, because that's when you panic mode. When you realize that, oh my gosh, it doesn't build at 11:59 when it's due in 59 seconds. And I wish I could say I've not seen that happen, but that happened way too many. What's the cost? You have to convince somebody that you're worth mentoring. Okay, it's a pretty low barrier. Like I said, you're offering free assistance. They're not going to look at you like you're a worm that's just crawled out of the ground over their shoe or something. It does require that you learn how to work in an existing team environment. You're not going to get to define the tools that are used. You're not going to get to define the source code control system. You're not really going to get to control a huge amount here, which is pretty much what it's going to be like if you go into industry too, or anything. Unless you suddenly decide that you're going to write your own operating system in your own language with your own tools, in which case then you can go, be the Temple OS guy. Guy writing his operating system. See, operating system is bad for your health. You're probably going to accomplish way less than you think. That's my expectation. Exceed my expectations, please. All that's going to do is increase the benefits. You might also find that you actually like it and you make acquaintances and you and getting involved in a project where you continue to work on it after this class. That could be a cost, right? I need another hobby. Some example projects. All the Apache projects are open source projects. Many of them relate to distributed systems. Not all of them. Just to name a few. I already mentioned Zookeeper. We have Ignite, we have Hadoop, we have Kerberos, we have Lucene, we have CouchDB. All distributed system projects. All real world projects. All of them in use. All of them with active communities. All of them with people who really do work on them to develop and extend capabilities of these packages. I don't want to do the Apache stuff. That's just like, ooh, whatever. Apache. Okay, so you can go work on MinIO, Amazon S3 compatible open source equivalent. Use the same basic APIs. I've already mentioned React, so I was like, I'll throw React in there as well. React is a distributed key value store written in Erlang. So maybe what your goal was is, I really want to work in Erlang. And now here's your opportunity. There are Rust projects. I found some interesting Rust projects as well that way. And then there was this one Rust project that sounded really cool because it was kind of based on the same ideas as the Java projects in course. And I went and I looked at the code and it was all written in Go. How would you call it a Rust project and write all the code in Go? So you might find that too. Wow, I'm going to work in Rust. And then you end up writing Java. Interplanetary file system. Great big huge distributed object store model of the universe. Interesting project. I keep looking at it going, weird, but maybe you want to work on it. That's cool. I still had some material from the last class, didn't have quite enough time to cover it. I already recorded it, it's already online, YouTube there. I see that like 30 people had already watched it. Count that as working. If it's not, then we'll get it out. I'm not going to cover that material in class. It is important, but this material is important. Anybody have any questions? Point. Oh, look, and it's 16 minutes till 4. We're right on time. Any questions about the previous lecture? I decided I was going to bring my my P100 mask today, just in case you're really worried. This is great. Why would you have a P100 mask? You know what P100? It actually means that it prevents 100% of particles in oil. So it's actually much more effective than an N95 or a KN95 mask, which only works in air. Air and oil are both liquids. I know you don't think of air as a liquid. That actually is. I use it because I raise ghost pepper, pulverize them. Ghost pepper powder. It is something you do not want to get anywhere near your eyes, nose, your mouth. Absolutely not. Don't know what a ghost pepper is. It is the hottest non-hybridized pepper of which we know. Now, it's Carolina Reaper plants, which are the hottest pepper that we currently have. Were hybridized from ghost peppers. You like spicy? So the scale is Scoville. Scovilles are a measure of capsicum, and a habanero is about 20,000 Scovilles. No, I'm sorry, a jalapeno is 20,000 Scovilles. A habanero is 100,000 Scovilles. Ghost pepper is about 1.2 million, and a Carolina Reaper is 4 or 2.5. And if you want pure capsicum powder, it's 12 million. But I love that math. Great, you actually want to make sure that nothing's going to get through it. It's great. I also use it for cutting onions, by the way. Onions always make me cry. Like, I don't want to cut my finger off because I'm crying. I can't see the knife. Let's talk about failure. Not yours, unless you're working for Southwest Airlines, because I did airlines last time. I was like, I'll just keep picking on airlines for a little bit longer. We could pick on airlines the entire class and not talk about any other class of failures, because airlines are nothing but distributed systems. The Southwest Airlines meltdown, and it turns out it's not the first, it's the latest one. Started on December 21st and lasted 11 days up until December 31st. There were lots of aspects of this meltdown. The root cause really was that they had limits to their ability to scale, not the least of which was, the cup I left here. Not mine. Had weather delay. Meant that they had to start rescheduling things, which meant that their scheduling software became under stress. And they have little hints that maybe there was a small scalability problem, like the fact that when they rescheduled individual workers, some real person had to call them on the phone. How is this going to scale? Well, it might scale if you got a few hundred even. Thousands doesn't scale. And I am a walking example of this. Anytime you have to start manually doing things, it breaks. Do things wrong. You increase the likelihood that something's not going to happen, something's not going to work. We see a tremendous amount of automation in distributed systems precisely because automation is much less likely to fail. When we have gone through and thought through our processes and developed them and debugged them and fixed the bugs we do find, they become more and more reliable, and the failures become less and less common. There's a side to that first, though. First side to that, and that is the failures tend to become harder to do. Technical limitations we understand as, and you will see this in the real world. People will make decisions about what they're going to do so that it's speedy, so it's fast, at the cost of doing something that's hacked that will come back to bite you later. And the older the software is and the longer it's been around, the harder it is to fix those things. It's a general rule. And if you are a technologist, if you are actual somebody who's developed software, what you will find is that management often does not want to spend any money to rewrite software that they say just works until it doesn't. And then you get a meltdown line. Lots and lots of analysis on this. It was kind of difficult because Southwest Airlines itself hasn't done an open kimono kind of analysis of the failure. So we have to read other people's analysis of the failure including people on LinkedIn and whatnot who have worked on the Southwest Airlines system. And essentially, this turns into exactly that kind of a management situation where people are like, well, why would we spend money to fix this? Because if I rewrite the software, it's going to be buggy. Rewriting software is not a guarantee that it's going to be better. In fact, if anything, it's kind of the opposite. So there's a natural tendency not to want to fix things if we can tolerate it. Downside of that is it means that we don't actually make those changes that need to be made until we get to the point where we can't tolerate it anymore. And it can cost us $825 million. Southwest, sorry, 821 million US dollars, what Southwest is now charging off against the cost of that meltdown. These are real numbers. This isn't somebody's just imaginary hand wavy number. Well, all right, the accountants imaginary hand wavy things here, but they basically said we think it's going to cost us $821 million as a result of this meltdown. That's not just to fix the meltdown. That's just as a byproduct of the meltdown. And that is the real challenge here. Distributed systems work great, but when they stop working, they tend to stop working in spectacular fashion that can cost companies a lot of money. Southwest Airlines will lose money as a result of that. Maybe it won't be exactly $820 million. Maybe it'll be $2 billion. Who knows? And I gave you a bunch of links articles in case you want to read more about that. I wish I could say it's hard to find these failures, but it's painfully easy. What's harder is to find failures where you have some decent analysis. My favorite analyses are really when it's the organization themselves. And some orgs actually have a culture of doing analysis after the fact so that they can gain a better understanding of what happened, what went wrong, and how we're going to prevent it from happening in the future. Yes? Do I think is there a way that we could eliminate distributed systems at the expense of subpar performance and still make it work? Sure. Absolutely. In fact, the pen and paper. But that doesn't, there are downsides to that as well. So I think that one of the hardest parts about this is the reason we build distributed systems is that it solves the scaling challenge. There are no other choices of which I am aware that make scaling particularly easy. If we start sending information over a network, we turn it into a distributed system. So to dive into your question a little, one layer deeper, if you get rid of the network, you can solve a lot of problems. We can just start using fax machines. Hey, those work great. How many of you have ever used a fax machine? I mean, I have virtual software that faxes things because there's occasionally, I work with lawyers sometimes, and they still use fax machines. Doctors still use fax machines. It's really weird. I haven't actually used a fax machine, actual fax machine, scanner followed by a transmission of image file, basically. Actual fax machine, really long time. I feel like giving someplace very backwards, like a doctor's office. They still do things manually. And even they are now using networks because we do telemedicine instead. Anybody work with EMR, electronic medical records? Yeah, one of the scariest classes I took in my master's program was Intro to Health Informatics, and a lot of it was about EMR. And then you learn what a total goat road. Like, oh, wow, we got a standard for how things are actually codified in EMR, but it's not descriptive enough, so we're going to create a new standard. And suddenly you have 10 times, I kid you not, 10 times as many ways of describing things in electronic medical records. And every single time they have replaced the EMR coding system, they literally have ballooned by about 10x. They're at the point now where you cannot have medical records that are not electronic. It's stunning. So the answer to your question is we really wouldn't actually have the world in which we live if we got rid of network. And so we're stuck with this. And we can do lots of things to make our distributed system more reliable. Otherwise, why would you pick a class like this? But they have a definite role. So my goal today is to talk about, and I'm building on what I talked about before. I introduced the idea of clocks and logical clocks and ordering of events. If I know things about the order in which events occurred, then I can start reasoning about them to understand what the global state was. Now, mentioned this last time. I'm going to mention it again this time. We are going to switch perspectives back and forth here. We're going to switch from this, I am the all-seeing, omniscient oracle. I can see the state of the system. And that's because I'm going to try to then put you in the position of, I am a bit player in this large distributed system. I can't see everything that's going on. How do I reason about what the state of the system is? And then at the end, I'm going to pull away that MacGuffin because there is no oracle. In the real world, there is no omniscient entity that knows what the global state is. But by that time, we will have talked about how individual nodes within the system can reason about what the global state could have been to a level that is close enough for us to make guarantees. And that's going to be sufficient. Of course, we're going to need some algorithms for this. Then we're going to talk about stable properties. I love the fact that the example that people like to give for a stable property is a deadlock. Okay, it is stable. It's not very useful, but it's stable. What's kind of neat about it is that, of course, I usually the operating system side of this build operating system. There's basically two ways of dealing with deadlock. There's the database way, and there's the operating system's way. In the operating system's way, we just say, you never do that. You define a canonical order in which locks must be acquired that has no cycles in it, and therefore you can have no deadlocks. I actually have a pair of patents in ways of doing this and detecting when you violated that. Because it's a constraint on the system, and it's just an implied constraint. You can actually track your locks. You can say, I'm sorry, but you grabbed those locks in this order here and in that order there, and therefore now you have a deadlock in your system. It doesn't actually wait until the deadlock occurs. It simply notices that you have violated the invariant. Sounds really simple. The fact that I got a patent on it's still amazing. Figure. Cool. So let's start with we talked about processes before and events, and now I've got a nice new picture. I cribbed off somebody else. I didn't like their artwork, so most of the effort in putting these slides together was getting an illustrator, making all of these, because your slides have to look, because I'm not, so gotta make the slides pretty. That way you'll stare at the slides instead of better. So we had processes last time. Before I was talking about messages. Now what we're gonna have are channels. Channels are the mechanism by which we deliver messages. The sending and receiving of messages is what's going to trigger our state changes. So you can see when I'm looking at process one labels its events based on its process number and then the order in which it observes the event. Nomenclature here is slightly different than the last lecture, but it's the same basic idea. You'll see that I've labeled requests or responses. You can actually see there are exchanges of messages. Hey, how you doing? I'm great. Request response style interchange. So we have processes, we have channels. Now we need we have two pieces of state. We have process state and we have channel state. And our state transitions, events, relate to changes in the processes as they receive messages across those channels. So we're going to say that when we run in this system, we end up with a valid sequence of events. Any valid sequence of events. But all the states that we actually observe in one big set. First I did this, then I did this, then I did this, then I did this. Now we're just doing this across multiple processes. Those processes could be on multiple computers. All good. The actual versus observed is this comment I made at the beginning, which is I'm going to actually step back and pretend I'm the oracle. That's the actual model, the one that we never actually will be able to see because it doesn't really work that way. You can actually make that happen. Having someone tell me about a terrible story. It was a great story. It was somebody who's software development who had been given a requirement that software perform a particular thing, which took all of the asynchronous out of this, forced it deterministic. And I was like, that's great, but the performance is going to suck. Because if you serialize everything in a distributed system, easy to reason about, and no one will use it because it will be too slow. Half of our goal here is parallelism. Let these independent processes act on things that they can see that don't matter to anybody else. That's the actual. That's the one we're not really going to see. All we get is a view from the individual processes. The process looks at that. I suppose we could do it from the network, channels, but it doesn't matter. Process or channel. We're going to focus on processes discussion because that's primarily what we control. We generally look at the network as being this service that we use. Unless you go into networking, in which case then you'll look at the processes as these annoying consumers of messages have to deliver. So when we start trying to capture the state of a system, we're going to capture the state at different points in time across the network, because we're not going to get a simultaneous cut. I wish we could, and we can if we're willing to cheat like Google did with spam. And so I've put a couple of potential cuts here. One of these cuts is, one of them is, and we're going to define consistency based upon whether or not we see the result of the message. So a cut is just a snapshot of state across the processes. It doesn't have to be at exactly the same time because we don't have a global clock, so we can't assume that we can do that. If we assume that we can do that, then we're back to the Oracle model. I can see everything all at once. I get to take a picture of the universe. At small scale, that works. In a data center on your computer, it's pretty close. We can pretty much get away with that kind of a model. As you move data centers across geographic locations, definitely can't do that. Even within the data center, you can't necessarily know what this across can interact. Because now there's just enough variation that I'm not going to get it at exactly the right time. Okay, so in a consistent cut, the state that we have captured obeys causality. What that means is that I can see the send of a message that I receive. If the cut shows me the receipt of a message but not its send, it is not a consistent cut. Wow, what happened? There's some state change that occurred on somebody else and I can see it over here, but I can't see it over there. So now I know that things are out of sync. There's a question in the back of the room. Okay, so the question was, why is C the consistent one? And this is me looking at this last night, going through exactly this and convincing myself of it. So C here is consistent. Very, very faint. C is consistent because the messages where I see the send and I don't see the receive, that's okay. C prime is not consistent because I see a receive of a message that I don't see the send. Does that make sense? Like I said, I knew this question was going to come up because I was looking at it going, because the original slides I'm cribbing off of didn't actually say which one was consistent. I had to walk through that and say, this is right. This is the trick. Now, in fact, the algorithm is going to deal with this by not actually capturing the state of a message that hasn't been received as well. So in order for us to consider it consistent in the algorithm that I'm going to go through, which is another Lamport contribution, that he and somebody else came up with apparently after a night of drinking. This is the brilliance of computer science. It comes when you're sober the next morning after you've been drinking the night before. That's to differ from art, where those inspirational moments come usually not sober. If C prime were to capture E subs E, if it came down here, then I wouldn't see that. That's not correct. Right. So if I were to eliminate E sub 3 super 6, then it would become consistent. Yep. This is just one little message floating around there. Wow, I see the state change on P3 that I don't see on P1, and therefore I no longer have a consistent cut. Captured a consistent state. Now, I mentioned this before when I was talking about transactional systems and the work that I did. And it's kind of cool because I didn't know any of this stuff when I was doing that work, because at the same time this stuff happened. It's okay to go back in time if your goal is to be consistent. So you're willing to lose a little bit of work in order to have this consistency guarantee, because with the consistency guarantee, I can actually provide you with guarantees of what I'm doing, of what my reliability is, what kinds of things you know about the state. An inconsistent cut cannot guarantee causality, and that's a real problem for us because we need to know how we got here, sort of. All right, so we're going to do snapshotting. Simple. Freeze the whole system. Everybody gives us their state, and then we unfreeze it. Problem with that? Does it work? It's the Oracle model. Freeze everybody, go gather up the state, and then unfreeze it. What's the problem with it? I already know. I figured that half of you know. You're just probably being shy and don't want to actually suggest it because you're afraid you might be wrong. It's okay to be wrong. And what's the problem with that? Let's say we could. What is the problem with that still? Ah, there we go. Yes. Woohoo. You win. It's super unperformant. There's no sense building a distributed system that doesn't scale. Here, let's build all this extra complexity and try to reason about all this weird out of order stuff and then make it really slow. So, I mean, my summary would have been, it sucks. That's just it. Sorry. But why would I pay millions of dollars to you to develop software that sucks? I mean, and if you're at Google and you're in LA, you're making more than $1 million a year. And that's what distributed system people who do this kind of work are at. Global snapshots are always consistent. If I can actually freeze the entire system and capture it, it's consistent. You're good. Golden. The challenge now that we know we can get a consistent state with this kind of draconian, heavy-handed, freeze the whole system, grab all of the state, and then record it, then we come up with something that's good enough without doing that, without having this global observer. And you know, because if there wasn't a way, I wouldn't be talking about this, would I? So instead, what I'm going to do is lead you through this primrose path of post-drunkenness from Lamport and the other guy on a way to do this. And there are multiple techniques now for doing this, but they get credit for doing one that's simple and explain to people, yes, this can be done. And then that encourages people to say, okay, well, can I do it better? So we're going to record events. A process now records any message that it sends before its snapshot, but it doesn't record any message that it sends after its snapshot in its state. So here's where I recorded my state. Now I'm going to accumulate the things that I haven't, that have happened after that state. This becomes like a transactional journal where I'm storing the things I'm going to do in a transactional log. It wasn't me. I don't know. Was that the skateboard? I'm sorry? Oh, I do it all the time because they keep moving the volume up down button from one side to the other. And it's like it's on one side of my iPad and the other side of my phone. And so sometimes I'm like trying to turn the volume down and instead I get the emergency call and you're like, this is just bad user interface design. Okay, so we're going to actually do the snapshotting by sending messages that are distinguished. We have these magic messages that say, hey, make a snapshot. How are we going to do this? Okay, so hand wave, hand wave, hand wave. Let's actually talk about what is it we're really trying to accomplish here. We don't want to rely on an external observer. There's no instantaneous snapshot. It's not going to happen all at the exact same time. We don't have a global clock, unless you cheat and you spend $500,000 per data center and you put an atomic clock in. And then even though you're cheating, there's still, you've now limited yourself to a window because there still is a propagation delay. It still takes time to send those messages between, oh, I don't know, Singapore and someplace very far away from Singapore. I know, Vancouver. I've done that. Yeah, it's a long flight. And then you're in Singapore. Kind of cool. Spent a week, spent 10 days in Singapore. And I was teaching a class at a company called Seagate, drive technology. And they were all hepped up about disk drives. Mostly wanted to ask me about how NTFS worked with. I'm sitting there teaching the file system, Windows file system. They're all concerned about why NTFS behaves the way it does. And then I went the following week uh, outside Delhi. All over again. So we're not going to pay because, yes, it works within a certain set of parameters. Very expensive. Google could pull it off. But we can still actually do this without spending $500,000 on clocks per place we install them. maybe Delhi to Vancouver is probably about as long network-wise as you can get. Years and years and years ago, when I was testing latency or examples of that, I was using a wideband satellite network, U.S. Advanced Research Project System, and it was about 2 seconds to send a message from Stanford up to the satellite network and across to the satellite network and back down to the location in the UK, and then get a response back. We can make this work. We really can. We don't need global clocks. The other thing to keep in mind here is that we have network variability, that networks do not deliver things at a uniform rate, not as a general rule. If I assume that the network is instantaneously fast, or if I assume that it's uniform, has a uniform delivery time, then that will make things easier for me to reason about as well. But the reality is that's not the way the networks work. If you want to pay the money, you can get that. You'll notice I keep going back to that money thing. There's always a financial constraint on these. So how do we solve this in the real world where resources are finite? A lot of sources of non-determinism. The network is a huge source of non-determinism. I send you 2 messages. They're not even guaranteed to arrive in the same order, let alone with the same spacing, or, God forbid, the same packets constitution. I could send you a file over a TCP stream and have different IP packets arrive with different sizes because they went over different routes. Oh, look, some of them went to China. That's not actually hypothetical. It has actually happened that the BGP routes have been adjusted in such a way that like 60% of the global internet traffic went through Chinese servers. Inadvertent. Can't imagine that the Chinese really wanted to that kind of packet load. I don't even know how you could that kind of a packet load effectively. But that's what happens when everybody trusts everybody else, and that's sort of the way that the internet itself gets routed. So in a non-deterministic operation, in a deterministic operation, it's easy. A happens, then B happens, then C happens, then D happens. In a non-deterministic operation, I don't have that kind of an ordering guarantee. I don't have that level of causality. You're sitting in this classroom. Maybe somebody you know is sitting in a different classroom. I'm sure probably not, because nobody has friends, right? They are experiencing things different than what you are experiencing. You have no idea the order in which they are experiencing them. But you're going to check in with them after class, and you're going to exchange state. You're going to talk about what happened or what's going on and whatnot, and you'll refresh some state. There's lots of stuff that will have happened. The order in which it happened doesn't matter. I don't care. Even in this case of the distributed system where we really are exchanging information that we both care about, there are likely things that you care about that I don't care about, and there are things that I care about that you don't care about, and the order in which they happened doesn't matter. It's going to be really important. It really is. So let's make this a little more formal. So processes are independent actors within, of course, we have lots of actors. Channels. Our model for channels is going to start out as being super simple. We can put more complications in it later, but we're going to start with a simple model, make it easier to reason about. They're unidirectional. They are first in, first out, so we actually maintain some level of ordering. And they are error-free. This is what TCP gives us. So it's not totally outlandish here. Of course, when we start getting really concerned about performance, because somebody's paying us to be really concerned about performance, we're going to start using UDP, which doesn't give us any of these guarantees. Directional? No, UDP doesn't really have a direction. You just kind of float that packet out there in the network, and maybe it will get to where it's supposed to go. Maybe it won't, but not my problem. You got to figure it out. And first in, first out. Okay. Except I built the randomizer for my network card that just picks a random packet and sends it in whatever order it wants. Those things do work, but it's harder for us to reason about them. So let's accept the fact that eventually we'll be able to reason about them. But for now, keep it simple. And the error-free thing, GDP, sorry. We use it because it's fast and cheap. What we want is an algorithm that allows us to create a consistent output, only using the processes and channels. So no extra mechanism involved. Can we do this? Again, of course, it's a rhetorical question at this point because if we couldn't do it, I wouldn't be wasting your time. And you have much better things to do at 16 minutes to 4 in some time zone. So let's start by creating snapshots. Because we can do things on the processes, and that's okay. So we're going to define that we can have snapshots in the process. And let's say that we have a snapshot after every state change. That's allowed. Now, it's not required. I can have snapshots with multiple state changes present in them. That's going to be the model I end up with, in fact. So we're going to have a nice way of labeling them. So we can say that S is the state of the process P at time 0, at time 1, at 2. Now, those times there are the snapshot times. They don't necessarily have to be the clock that we're using for messages, although eventually it's probably going to be easier for us from a nomenclature perspective to same timestamp. But we can use different clocks. So when process Q wants to initiate a checkpoint, a global cut, I'm going to try and record the system state. We're going to create a magic message, request the marker message. With the marker message, we're going to make a snapshot of the state on this node. We're going to send that marker message to everything we can talk to. If we have a channel to it, we're going to send a request to it. Hey, I want you to capture your state. And so when that request gets to the process P, it says, okay, well, I'm going to capture my state at this point. And I'm going to send marker requests. I'm going to send snapshot requests on all of my channels. So we're flooding the network now. That message is going to come back to process Q. And process Q is going to say, oh, this is the marker I sent. Oh, that's cool. Well, now I know what process P's state was because process P that marker message. Now I can doing something with it. Now I have a complete snapshot. Process Q has recorded snapshot of both P and Q, and it indicates that there is a single outstanding message. Because P had sent it, but Q had not received it yet. So Q says, oh, yeah, that's that message I got after I sent the marker request, but before I got your snapshot. So that's great. I don't have to consider that message. I can include it because it was sent but not received, and therefore it doesn't matter yet. Now we're going to generalize this. We have an initiator. The initiator saves their own state and then requests that everybody else save their state. And then the non-initiators, which would be any of the other processes in the system, receive that first marker. At that point, they save their state. They send their marker on all of their channels. They can resume execution, but now they have to start keeping track of what additional messages did I send after that last snapshot. Gosh, it kind of sounds like a log, doesn't it? Kind of is a lot, but conceptually, we're just storing some extra. How we store it, we don't have to worry yet. It's this point, resume execution. That is really our goal here. Question in the back. Not yet. We're going to get there. It takes a little bit of walking through the algorithm and then explaining why this gives us anything other than just a pile of random. Right. So you're going to have marker, and then, oh, these are the messages I sent after that. Potentially, yes. Don't get too bogged down in the implementation. That'll be, I'm laying the groundwork for talking about consensus protocols. It's going to be really important here. They're going to be different ways of achieving exactly this, which is a sense of global state, consistent global state. And now at least we have a definition of consistency. Remember I mentioned that's really hard, that whole defining consistency. We've defined consistency for our purposes. This now guarantees we have a consistent state. And the question in the back was, okay, and we're gonna lead through that. So, assumptions in the algorithm. There's no failures. All the messages are intact. They arrive only once. Now, you may have noticed if you've started working on project 2, there's this AMO thing. Point. You can actually implement the message only arrives once. If I have to retransmit messages because I think that maybe the message got lost on the network, the recipient can keep track of the fact that they have seen that message already and have processed it and therefore will not process it again. So at most once means 0 or 1 time, even if I get multiple copies of a duplicate request. The communications are first in, first out ordered. They are unidirectional. Could have made them bidirectional. I mean, just have 2 directional links and suddenly that avoid a bidirectional. The process is capturing its local state and then additional state information that it's sending on those channels after it captures its local. Those are the messages that I've sent after I capture and make the snapshot. Algorithm does not change normal execution of processes. That's the whole point here. I'm doing a little extra work, but I'm not perturbing the order in which things happen. I'm not perturbing them in a way in which anything should change. It shouldn't affect the outcome. So let's look at the processes perspective of this algorithm. Been kind of looking at this from the global view, but now let's say I'm just a process. I'm a process. I decide that I want to know, hey, what's the global state? So I record my own state. I send a marker message to all of my channels, and then I just start doing normal processing. If I'm not the initiator, I receive a marker message, then if I haven't previously recorded any state, then I record my own state and I create an empty list of messages. I haven't sent any messages after capturing that. Otherwise, if I have recorded state, then my message list is now the list of messages I've sent since I made this snapshot. So the point here is that I'm going to see potentially the same marker come back, right? Because I send it out and then it gets sent back eventually. Because the reality is that most networks are bidirectional, but we've made it unidirectional. So we have to account for the fact that we might see the marker come back, but we might not. In fact, ultimately, What we care about is when the initiator sees all of the messages come back from all of the processes that it knows. Now, there is an implicit assumption here. And I just realized this as I'm walking through this. The implicit assumption here is I actually know all the actors. I know how many actors there are. So this is not an unbounded solution. This is not a solution that, as we've described it here, is going to work if I don't know who else is playing in this particular sandbox. Now, we will move forward later and talk about protocols that are more dynamic than that. So, in other words, I need to know who all the players are, but that the set of players can change over time as long as I know about them. That's going to become important because in distributed systems, it is quite likely that you will have individual processes that disappear because they died, and they will have individual processes that appear because they've been spun up. The last project, which is about a sharded key value store. The reason we shard things is because we do load balancing. And one of the hardest parts about building a sharded key value store is the ability to add additional shards. The idea of sharding is not a new one. I don't know if you've run across it before, but the basic observation is if I have a large enough task, sometimes I benefit by splitting it up into smaller pieces and having multiple processes do individual parts of that. But by itself, that doesn't give me resilience. So I'm going to make it even more complicated. Like the difference between mirroring drives, in disk drive mirroring, I have two, they're exactly identical. That gives me high resilience, but no extra, it's at the cost of twice as many disks. You got a question? It gets the marker request. Yes, so the process is already working on things, and it gets this request to make a snapshot. That's a great question. So does a marker request, does a snapshot request from another node go to the front of the queue, or is it simply processed in order? Anybody suggest an answer? And there's no wrong answer actually in this case. That's why I thought this was a great question. That's why, exactly. It doesn't matter. You can make either one work. You can reason about either of those. Imagine that you had, yeah, you can make either one of them work. But why don't we just assume that it's always processed in order, not that it's not a head of queue scheduling, just to make it easier for us to think about. So yes, I might have 5 different messages that arrive from the other process on that channel, and I will see the 4 messages and then I'll see the marker. And that works fine. And I think for purposes of this discussion, that keeps the model simple. So this is known as the Chandy-Lamport algorithm, which really Leslie Lamport's discussion of this was that they had been out drinking wine the night before and talking about this problem and didn't solve it, but then both of them met each other the next morning. They had not only solved it, but they had come up with the same solution. Andy was at University of Boston, if I remember. Lunch. Lamport's in Seattle, so he's not too far away. If end up working at Microsoft Research, bump into Leslie Lamport. I've not met him. I have met Donald Knuth. Probably heard of him. But nicest person I think I've. Absolutely very nice guy. Really tall, very skinny. And of course, benefit of being at Stanford was that had a problem with tech, you just go ask him, and he would talk to you. He was one floor down from me. Anybody know what tech is? probably one of the oldest building things. Tech was originally, I think, and that's the current version that we. And then Leslie Lamport decided that he wanted to write a macro package for tech, so he wrote Lamport Tech macros on top of tech. That's how you get LaTeX. Latex, but it's from Lamport. He shows up all. Can't get rid of the guy. So the Chandy-Lamport algorithm doesn't guarantee we get any state that existed. That's the best part about it. It gives us a possible state, and it's consistent, but it isn't necessarily a state that ever actually happened. Oh, so is this going to be useful for us? I'm going to ask you to suspend your disbelief for the moment. But the reason it will be useful for us is because it guarantees that we have a consistent state. And that consistent state will end up being isomorphic to any of the other states that could have arisen. That's why it's going to end up being useful for us. Consistency is really key, even though this only gives us a possible global state, not necessarily any global state that actually happened. And now we've got the doubter in the middle of the room who's going to say, no, why? I doubt me all the time. Is consistent. Or the order in which they actually occurred in the real world isn't material to the outcome of the state of the system. Does that make sense? So the fact that you did A then B or B then A, and if that has no effect on the actual state of the system afterwards, yes, that's kind of the point, is that it doesn't matter. And that's actually why I'm going to spend the next little bit talking about that, because it's important to be able to understand that the reason we can get away with this is because there are things that happen that don't matter. There's a level of detail that ends up being immaterial. And that's my hand wavy description of it. That's my intuitive description of it. The slides are about the formal description of why that works. So they're supposed to appeal to your rational brain, and my hand wavy thing is supposed to appeal to your irrational brain, of which maybe one or two of you have an irrational portion of your brain. I'm trying to balance the intuition against the formalism of understanding. Okay, so now I'm going to throw out a completely red herring. This is my contribution to the slide deck that I borrowed heavily from. And that is this really interesting area called lattice theory. And this is a particular concept in mathematics. It's actually quite complicated, but it's actually very applicable to exactly what we are talking about here. And this is this idea of having partially ordered sets, posets or posets or whatever, however they pronounce it. They talk about posets all the time in literature about these things. We use them heavily in distributed. I've mentioned CRDTs, which are a form of consistent data structure, and more recently, there have been proposals, more recently being like 3 years ago. There was a paper at UPSLA about what's called MRDT. And if you want to know more about lattice theory, online book and broken into whatever reason, PDFs are big. Download them all at once. So dial-up. This isn't a particularly old area of mathematics. Most of the work that's been done in lattice theory is like within 20 years. So within your lifetime, which makes it very young in the world of mathematics versus almost anything else in mathematics. Where anyone taken 421? So 421, you talk about Turing machine. Alan Turing described his model of machine in 1936, about 6 months after his PhD advisor Alonzo Church published his model of computation. That was about a decade after, a little more than a decade, Herman total published his model. And Turing ends up getting the prize, not because the model was somehow different from the other two. It was just, and then he proved that it was equivalent. Lattice theory is pretty new. It doesn't date from the 1930s, from 80s or more recent. But it is very useful in distributed systems because it is in fact exactly about the kind of equivalency we're talking about, where we have multiple potential paths through a graph and how we can make them equivalent, because the fact that we pick one path versus a different path ultimately doesn't matter, because we can tell you what happened, where we started from and where we end. So it's like you probably have multiple ways of getting here to this class. It doesn't really matter which path you take. They get you to where you need to go. And we're going to be able to collapse that down, and that's going to make it easier for us to analyze. All right. So the point here is that if I actually have these runs, remember runs are just all the possible different paths through the execution state, then I have all these different permutations. Now, this was the other slide that took me a lot of time because the slide I was cribbing off of, they didn't use sigma, S's. They have this picture with sigmas in it, and they use S's in the thing. So I got to go and use the lovely PowerPoint equation editor, which kind of sort of works like math mode and tech. Right. Oh my gosh, we're late. So we're gonna end here because it's 9:19. Problem is, I look at that clock, it's 14 minutes till. So I will finish recording the notes on this and continue to play this trick, which is terrible, right? But nobody comes back and asks questions, so I guess the lectures afterwards must be tolerable. All right. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week on Tuesday if I don't see you at office hours at 4 o'clock this afternoon. And I am going to hibernate this thing.